Okay, hello everyone. I'm Jamie Flinchball here. We're conducting our discussions about the topic of strategic thinking and planning and the process. I have our guest here, Josh Ehrig, who besides sharing a barber with me, or at least a hairstyle, is a good friend and on the faculty at Lehigh University, working a lot with entrepreneurs. So, Josh, why don't you do a little more to introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, first, thank you for having me here, Jamie, today. I think the haircut barber joke never gets old, and I always appreciate it. So I'm a professor of practice here at Lehigh University in the Department of Management. I teach undergrad and graduate courses in entrepreneurship, strategy, and innovation. I come from a entrepreneurial background. I first started on Wall Street, then went into building companies. I built a few tech companies, both acquired and failed, and everything in between. So I know what it takes to miss payroll, and I know what it takes to get acquired, and everything in between. And from there, decided to accept a position at Lehigh, and been proud to represent the university ever since.
Yeah, and I think that background says a lot about the professor of practice, right? It's someone who has real experience, where you're approaching it from an academically oriented but informed by real world perspective, and certainly the students benefit a lot from that going through the process there. So we have some questions here, and like all of them, to your background, right? Everyone's background will bias some of these answers, which is, I think, what makes these interviews so valuable. So the first one, when I first wrote this question, I didn't know how perhaps powerful it was, but I've been enjoying asking it. And is strategy a process? Is it a decision, or is it a way of thinking? How do you view that?
Yeah, so I think that's actually a really tough question. I think if you look at strategy by definition, right, we kind of define it as a plan of action or policy designed to achieve a major or overall aim, right? But I don't think it's as simple as that. I actually think it's all. I think it's the process, the decision, and thinking are all kind of interconnected to strategy. I think it's simplistic to just look at it individually. I think it's really the sum of the parts. We talked about my background being in entrepreneurship, but really what I've seen the opportunity is in developing entrepreneurial strategies within existing organizations, what we call incumbents, right? So where mindset, business model innovation, right, search versus execution, and understanding those underlying, shifts and broad macro environmental changes that challenge and transform your existing assumptions, but also understanding, acquiring, and executing on core competencies in the process that your organization takes to achieve this, while maintaining culture, right? One that kind of ensures that adaptability and flexibility. So in the process, this kind of challenges companies to conceptualize themselves as organizations. So, for me, it encapsulates a lot of different things at once. I think I've seen a lot of organizations that look at it as just a process or just as a decision. Rarely do I see it as a way of thinking. I never see it really, kind of permeate, within the culture of an organization. I think that's something we'll probably touch on later on, hopefully in the segment as well.
Yeah, and I certainly think that's right, and some of it just comes from organizations' ability to affect process, which is relatively easy, versus how people think, which is relatively harder. So just a follow up on that,
Yeah.
is the balance, as you say, it's all three. Do you see the balance between all three being relatively similar between entrepreneurial and intrapreneurial efforts?
Yeah. So you talk about process, decision, and way of thinking, right? See, it's interesting. That's why I brought up the search versus execution, right? You talk about Steve Blank. Incumbents fundamentally are in execution. They already have a business model. They're just executing on it, right? The holy grail, product market fit.
Right.
Whereas startups, right, being entrepreneurs, you're continuously searching for that business model through discovery and validation of customers. What a lot of, but they're on a limited time resource constraint. But what a lot of existing companies really don't do is once they get to that execution stage, they kind of stay involved and, they stay in that sphere. They never actually shift back to the search stage as they're introducing new processes, products, whatever it might be. They stay in that execution stage. And I think that's where it goes wrong. I've presented, in front of, project managers, consultants, where I've kind of asked, how many of you, just assumed what the customer wanted, created the product, and then found out the customer, it wasn't even close, right? And they all raised their hands.
Yeah.
And that's a costly mistake that as a startup, right, in the search stage, you make that mistake with limited runway, you're completely done.
Yep.
You don't have a business anymore. You can afford to do that perhaps with more flexibility of time and resources within an existing organization, but that's actually changing, right? So you look at the rapid technological change occurring, the EBITDA volatility that is increasing. I think by 2027, I think 75%, I think it's 2026 actually, 75% of the S&P 500 will be displaced, right? So, and I think that acceleration is only continuing. So I think a lot of existing companies have to make that mindset shift, right? Almost that cultural shift in a sense, which is really, really hard to do, to go from that continuous operation of execution to search, right? And continue that process throughout. There needs to be that continuous feedback loop. I'm not sure existing organizations always do a great job of that. I think there's been some, if you look at the advent of design thinking and so forth and how that's being implemented into organizations, I think that's been a step forward, right? But I think it's one thing to talk it and to preach it. I think it's another thing to actually do it.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be really hard.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that idea of the speed of the change is might inform this next question, really related to what exists in organizations. So as I've worked with organizations and get to see their list of, here's the core competencies we want our employees to have and what they're going to get graded on or evaluated on, strategic thinking is often listed on a list. It's a pretty generic list often, but still it's there, especially for managers, executives. So does everyone need that as a capability? Is it just for a select few? Is it just for the CEO? Who needs that strategic thinking as a capability?
Yeah, so I've thought a lot about this actually. My short answer is unequivocally everyone. And there really is a dichotomy, in my opinion, that exists from both the strategic and tactical perspective. So within a tactical role, you're executing on strategic directives, right, that are generally somewhat narrowed and defined in scope. But they are actually probably, in most cases, closer to process, distribution, customer, key partners, right, that can inform on present and future strategic directives, right? So they kind of help close that feedback loop. Strategic C-level execs aren't always, and typically don't have that opportunity, right? So, by creating that continuous feedback mechanism between both, you kind of are able to kind of provide more real-time decision-making potential and empowerment at different levels of the organization. And it's interesting, Jamie, I actually challenge my MBA students to do this from day one. It's really uncomfortable because you have a lot of my students will come from more tactical roles, and then I'm like, well, you're now going to learn to think you're going to now become a strategic thinker and execute on strategic initiatives, right, in ways you've never done before. And they see, we look at the business model canvas, for example, all of a sudden they do their entire company on a business model canvas, and they're like, wow, I've actually never viewed my company quite like this before. And it's really uncomfortable, right? Because you're so used to being within that narrow, defined role. But once again, I think both parties can coexist and create a more real-time feedback mechanism. I think that's going to be imperative, right? When we talk about how things are accelerating from a change and volatility perspective.
Yeah, and I think that speed of change is a big factor, right? So when it happens slower, you can, even if it's not the best way, you can conceive of a strategy and then go execute it for a while. But if you have to be making choices strategically while executing because things change so fast, then it really needs to be a more distributed capability. Um, given that complexity, right, you have changes happening all the time. It's not like a fixed window where you have all the inputs and off you go. How do you make sure you get all the right inputs? You have knowns, you have unknowns, you have insights, you have all these variables. How do you get the right inputs um, and enough inputs to craft good strategy?
Yeah, so I'm really a proponent of, the decision maker ultimately needs to make the call, right? I mean, the origins of strategy come from the Greek word, the general's art, right? So probably historically speaking, we're probably not too far off, but it's interesting. My colleague and I have actually developed some proactive scenario-based planning tools and techniques around societal shifts, for example, so that organizations' business models can continuously adapt to externalities and not become fundamentally displaced. So our thesis is essentially, Jamie, that incumbents should adapt this mindset and tools like this, or risk irrelevancy.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So this is something that I'm increasingly seeing is as organizations, they're feeling like they're not as relevant. Right. Things are moving a little too fast. When we looked at Clayton Christensen's kind of original definition of disruptive innovation, and we didn't see the technology mediums and the disintermediation that has been caused by those mediums to happen at such an accelerated pace as it has happened over really the past 10, 15 years
Mm-hmm.
with the advent of mobile and so forth. I think it's got to start at the top in terms of there needs to be an ultimate decision maker. And I know you've kind of been through your own battles with this as well, and I'd be curious to understand your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea, right, is that you're going to have imperfect information. You'll never get perfect. And so you need a constant feed, you need a constant thread and know what to start to pay attention to and what not to. And I do think people need to craft their information architecture more deliberately, where you can stumble upon slow shifts a little bit, right? You can just be out there in the world, engage, pay attention, listen, and as long as shifts are slow enough, you can pick up on them, right? But when they're happening faster, you probably need some type of architecture around how you're going to get your information. And ultimately, right, those are inputs, those are ideas, those are even opinions, but there does have to be someone ultimately piecing all that together and making a decision, whether it's a company decision or a smaller level. It's still the same factors of imperfect data and ambiguity apply.
Right. Yeah. And I've noticed a lot where a lot of organizations they'll have their once a year kind of retreat or some of that nature where they'll say, hey, let's look at our business model right now. And my sense is that operating under that kind of more static model, you're continuously going to be reactive and not proactive. I really think it needs to be dynamic at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
And so that you can get into the practice of being more proactive. I mean, inevitably there's going to be things that you need to be reactive about, but the more time spent on reactivity, the less time spent on actually creating proactive value that really lends itself to more of a sustainable organization.
Yeah. And you mentioned in there, like, looking at the current model, right? So that becomes a factor. I know I've mentored entrepreneurs and sometimes your students as student entrepreneurs, and they want to shift or they want to pivot, and they're showing me what they have and what they're pivoting to, and they're not leveraging anything of what they've done, which to me just says it's a whole new business then, which is fine. That's what you want to do, but to me that's not even a pivot. So you have assets, you have capabilities, you have relationships, you have all bunch of stuff in place once you're in executing mode. How much does that and should that influence your strategy Should you operate within parameters? Should you put it all aside? Should you look for leverage? How do you look for what you can do relative to where you are today?
Yeah, so it's funny you asked that question. I've been honored to kind of witness you do that firsthand, right? But you've done a great job demonstrating this with one of the organizations you've been involved with, right? Where you kind of identified core competencies within your existing business model, and then you translated that to new market opportunities, right? Based off of market shifts that were occurring and maybe perhaps still are occurring, right? So, uh, but what are our core competencies, right? So for those who may not be aware, those are kind of those deep proficiencies that enable a company to deliver unique value, right, to their customers. And the resources, right, that a company has. And when I say resources, it doesn't necessarily mean tangible, right? It could be intangible, or it could even be organizational capabilities that you can leverage that can kind of enable you to kind of develop and sustain that long-term competitive advantage. But the thing that also is really important here is that the competencies, this can also be competencies that you need to acquire depending on where you're at in relationship to the displacement curve, right? So we were talking about that before, because I think a lot of times we don't always pay attention to our existing core competencies, but sometimes we're somewhat blind to acquiring the core competencies that are necessary, or we don't want to admit that we personally are lacking, a specific competency within our organization.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where, and you have to put your pride to the side, right? As an organization, as an individual. I mean, fundamentally, that's what an organization is. It's a group of individuals. You have to put those emotions, the pride to the side and own that you need to acquire these competencies in order to remain relevant.
Right.
So.
Yeah. So just building on that, there's you talk about acquiring capabilities, new capabilities that help you enable your strategy. You can build those, right? You can practice and go learn and build up that competency over time, or you can go buy it, right? Either acquiring a company or simply partnering with someone and hiring it in as a skill. How do you think about the build versus buy when it comes to a decision, when it comes to core competencies?
Yeah, or even an acqui-hire, right? I mean, we see this with startups all the time where they're only interested in acquiring specific human capital talent or something of that nature. The build versus buy trade-off is, I think, really interesting. It can work either way, right? So, if you have the core competencies to build it, that may make sense, as it may not interfere with culture or other kind of items I think are really crucial to an organization. That being said, if you don't, it may make more sense to buy those competencies, right, or acquire them, as I was saying before. And I think that's crucial to not only enabling the organization to create this more sustainable competitive advantage, but also to enable them to move forward in perhaps new directions that the market's kind of dictating they need to do, right, in order to survive. And so I've seen it work both ways, both successfully and unsuccessfully, Jamie.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going through acquisitions. Both you and I have both gone through acquisitions. I think the media portrays them one way, and I think the reality of a lot of acquisitions works in another way, at least for me personally. Where there's cultural aspects, there's operation aspects, even down to different processes and so forth, where you're totally not on the same page, and that leads to friction and ultimately doesn't allow you to capitalize on some of the synergies that made the acquisition, or the partnership attractive to begin with.
Yeah, so ultimately, those capabilities that you acquire have to fit in and integrate into your system, and there's lots of barriers to that, one way or the other. So you just have to at least understand them and manage them. Otherwise, you don't really having the capability and leveraging the capability become two different things. So yeah, we see that happen many, many times. So earlier you had talked about kind of going back to a decision maker, someone that has to put it all together and make a decision. Kind of giving you two extremes. I've worked with particularly founders that are fantastic at articulating their vision. They can sell it to investors. They can even sell it to customers, but the employees still don't know what they need to do to deliver on it. And then at the other end, you have very good strategic founders who can do a lot, and CEOs at other levels who simply can make lots of decisions, and it results in a strategy, but the employees can't figure out what that strategy is. So those are the extremes. But ultimately, what's the most effective way for someone to get the strategy from head to mouth to action, and into that understanding about how they understand, comprehend, and can deliver on that?
Yeah, and I think that starts with whoever that leader is, right? In terms of authenticity, credibility, right? Relevancy, for that matter. I know even as a professor of practice, Jamie, you've got to continue to stay relevant because I think students absolutely deserve real time, like this is what's happening out there, and not necessarily just theory, right? So I think the question's a little bit deeper, actually. I think you need to be cognizant of employee composition. So, I know in at least with millennials and Gen Zs, for example, they really resonate with things like the golden circle, right? Like Simon Sinek, and purpose, and what's the why behind that, and kind of driving that, right? And so, I think not having that kind of clearly articulated kind of internal, and I would actually argue external, right, value proposition could actually be counterproductive in terms of your overall output and morale, right? So I think it not only is about authenticity and relevancy, but I think it's about clearly articulating the purpose, right? That why, because, I think Sinek does a great job in the why, how, and what, but generally people communicate the what, but they don't resonate on another level on the why, on the purpose, and strategy is always grounded in some purpose, right? But you're just giving the what behind that. I mean, fundamentally, we're humans, and we're motivated, we're incentivized by things that are personal to us, right? And how do you kind of make that interconnection between the why, the purpose of the strategy, and the composition and needs and I don't want to say perhaps wants of your employees. And I think you need to be able to bridge and connect the two at the end of the day. So I don't think there's one general solution to this question. I think it's a little bit deeper than that. And I think it comes down to circumstantial and situational aspects related to that composition.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And I think the idea of understanding the composition of your employees and what they need, right? Whether it's 5 employees or 5,000, is really important. And the context around, Gen Z and millennials wanting more connection to that purpose means that this might be an increasingly important skill for leaders to have, is that articulation of why, so that people have some connection to the purpose. Otherwise, you might not just have the talent that you want to deliver on it.
Yeah, and that comes, and empathy comes into play with that as well, right? So, but it's interesting, Jamie, and I don't know if you've observed this or not, but working with startups and working with large organizations, I've asked, the C levels, right? And that might be somewhat oxymoronic on a startup level, right? And I guess the co-founders might be a better term for that. But I've asked them to articulate, what is your value proposition? And within a 3 or 4 person organization, right, if you want to call it that, they all have different definitions of what that message is. And you see that obviously in large organizations too. So really, it's actually an opportunity for somebody at the C level of a large organization to be able to really get everyone on the same page in terms of articulating that value proposition. Because, you know, when we're externally interfacing as representatives of the organization, our message should really be coherent and cohesive. And I generally don't see that. And I think that's kind of an underlying problem. And the optics, quite frankly, aren't always good when that happens.
Okay. Yeah, I think those are some of the challenges, and you know, we don't, other than when we do teach entrepreneurship, and of course there's a debate about whether you can teach entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
But I think you can teach it. I certainly believe in that. I've invested my both time and money into that absolute belief. You can't make someone an entrepreneur, but you can teach some of those fundamentals that make them better at that. And those are some of those skills that I think entrepreneurs need to start learning before they jump into the waters, if
Yeah.
they at least have that opportunity.
Well, it's funny you brought that up, Jamie, because I don't think either of us have ever taught entrepreneurship.
Sure.
I think we've both facilitated entrepreneurship, mindset, thinking, concepts, etc. There is no substitute for getting out there, learning, you know, feeling the pain. You know, we talk about concepts like customer discovery, you know, we talk about market sizing, competitors, etc. It's one thing to understand those concepts, but the real discomfort for students is when they have to actually go out there with whatever idea they have and actually learn those things and then come back knowing that they're about to fail in front of everyone else. And that's such an important skill set, right? I mean, we're fundamentally scared of being wrong, right? We're scared of being awkward and we're scared of being wrong. But, you know, if you're scared of being wrong, you know, as Peter Thiel kind of argues, then you're not fundamentally building a valuable company at the end of the day. And, you know, because you really don't have a secret per se. You're not willing to put yourself out there in that sense. And
Yep.
and so I've kind of changed my thoughts of, you know, we're really not gatekeepers of scarce content. The content's out there, right? We're facilitators of the noise and what's good versus not, and helping students to kind of navigate through that noise and provide the most effective and efficient way to address these problems, right? I mean, when you and I first started, we didn't have these opportunities, these programs, these classes to accomplish this, right? The learning curve was quite steep and it was quite painful. And so by facilitating this in a kind of a safer environment for the students, right, where they don't have families and mortgages at risk, I think makes life a little bit easier for them while still kind of experiencing that pain, right, going through that emotional roller coaster. But from an entrepreneurial aspect with existing organizations, it's really uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, I don't need to know anything about being an entrepreneur. What does this even mean? And you know, because you're kind of stuck in that dogma of you know, well, what works, let's not fix it, right, or whatever it might be. But the reality is that having those skill sets and the mindset associated with what entrepreneurs go through, I think it will not only benefits them individually, but as an organization as a whole.
Right. Well, and to your point around facilitation, you know, it's a lot of my listeners and readers know that I love soccer analogies. We like to say in soccer coaching that the game is the best teacher, right? Not the coach.
Yeah.
And so it's a similar thing where we might be the coach, but the game is the best teacher. So last question before I let you go is, do you have any tips or tricks or just guidance on how do you convert strategy to execution? Because ultimately only a demonstrated strategy is a real one.
Right. So so this kind of goes into a few different things, actually. I think it's, number one, is a real challenge for organizations in aggregate. We tend to be somewhat complex, right? We tend to want to empower, and we tend to create kind of accountability mechanisms, right? And the challenge is that you can be absolute in one, but if you are, you kind of create deficiencies in another, right? So the real question is, how do you align your incentives with executables in a way that balances the objectives and expectations of all in the internal and perhaps even the task environment, right? So, and stable leadership is really important in bridging those objectives and outcomes. Right. So, and that kind of leads into how you would actually even measure that. Right. We talk a lot about KPIs and, key performance indicators and so forth. But, what KPI, people just say, well, we want sales to go up by X, or, we want revenue per employee to go up by Y%. But I think you need to break it down into fundamentally, what are the assumptions that you're trying to validate, right? Not from both an input, right, those drivers that are leading indicators, but also from an output level as well, right? So those actual results, which are generally lagging indicators. I think we tend to be result driven, right, on the output side, but we're really not measuring the drivers on the input side that are equally, if not even more beneficial in a lot of respects to the learning and be able to iterate and pivot as you're going through that process, right? Instead of just being, beholden to that one process or procedure to get to that final output. And I kind of view it both qualitative and quantitatively, right? We generally, well, my students definitely gravitate towards the qualitative, but in kind of when you're out there, you tend to gravitate towards the quantitative. I think there's benefit to both at the end of the day. And one of the things I recommend, Jamie, not only for startups, but also for existing companies is how do you phase this approach? Right? I think too many times organizations kind of permanently, it's like the strategy is etched in stone. This is what we're going with. This is what we promise stakeholders, right? But how do you do it in a way where you can phase it? Right, and have measurable KPIs from an input and output level within each phase, right? So that you can actually iterate and pivot, kind of that lean, build, measure, learn model within each phase, instead of waiting till the end and kind of say, okay, well, what did we learn, Jamie? Well, we learned that we probably should have pivoted about 9 months ago and about $100 million, earlier.
Right.
And so because being agile is it's a buzzword, but it's important, right? And so if you can have almost like these micro phases with built-in KPIs within each phase, I think that kind of changes the equation. Now you might have these overall aggregate macro KPIs associated with that entire thing as well. And then ultimately, how those strategic objectives ultimately benefit the organization as a whole. So those are kind of maybe my two macro points that I think C-levels, organizational leaders can benefit from. But then it also empowers the more tactical individuals within those phases, right? To kind of take ownership of those KPIs instead of it just coming from the strategic. But that's the dichotomy, right? If I'm in that tactical role, I'm only thinking about what's in front of me and what I need to deal with and accomplish by the end of this week. Right. As compared to being in that driver's seat in the strategic role. I think there's a place for both where you can kind of merge both, where the tactical can be incorporated into that phased approach, right? And derive empowerment and accountability, whereas the strategic can own that, the whole aggregate of the three phases or whatever, the phases might be, and kind of drive that strategic objective. And I think when you can empower everyone from the organization, both strategically and tactically, in a way where you have that continuous feedback loop, right? I think everyone ends up benefiting, and you're a lot more proactive, or you're able to react a lot faster to this volatility. Right, both in the marketplace, like we're seeing right now, right? I mean, people are calling me up to say, what does runway and burn rate mean, right? And this isn't just startups, right? These are individuals in existing companies,
right?
And the more I hear this, the more I think it's necessary that everyone, larger companies needs to really not only adopt this kind of more agile approach, but also move beyond just the execution and go into the search, right? It's not about failing, right? failure is inevitable, but I don't purposely try to fail, right? And I don't think we tell our students or our companies we advise on, we don't tell them to do that.
Right.
But at the same time, it's inevitably going to happen. So if you can kind of provide micro aspects to the whole macro perspective, your ability to fail and react and bounce back from it, I think the probability of your success goes up.
Yeah. So fundamentally, you can't just set a strategy and execute it. You've got to be adjusting and flexible, agile, and learning as you go to make this successful. So I think we're out of time, but really want to thank you, Professor Ehrig, for your time and insights, and I'm sure many people will benefit from hearing your perspective as your students do today.
I appreciate that. Thanks for having me, Jamie, and stay well.
Thank you. You too.
All right. Thank you very much.